Welcome. I'm joined today by Candace Enman. Candace is the president of Welch Capital Partners. Candace is a longtime friend and colleague, and we are very fortunate to have her here this afternoon. Candace, we recently spoke with Stefan, your partner, about preparing for the ultimate sale. And he helped us with getting our house in order and all the things we should be doing well in advance of this time. We then spoke with Ron Prehogan. Ron was very informative about family matters. So what do you have to consider? It's a family business. You guys have been at it for a number of years. So we got all that under consideration. Now we're at the point where we're ready to pull the trigger. Lead us through the M&A process. So what's next? What should we expect next?
Thank you, Mike. Happy to be joining you today. I guess the first thing an owner has to do is really to decide whether they want to sell their business on their own or engage a professional advisor. So obviously I'm biased and believe there's a lot of value in having someone manage the sales process, but also recognize that some transactions are more complex than others, and some owners simply want to transact themselves. Advisors can really add value though, especially when owners want a competitive process. They value the expertise of negotiations and deal structuring and understand really the importance of keeping their focus on running the business while simultaneously trying to sell it.
Yeah, and I'm reminded by a good buddy of mine, a smart CPA that decided his house was beautiful and he was going to sell his house on his own. And he's got neighbors up and down the street. There was 2 or 3 other houses for sale, and they'd throw an open house on at the same time, and everybody was going into their house. Nobody was coming to his house. So finally he said, this is ridiculous. Hired an agent and ended up getting more money than he was trying to get on his own. So how do you get that competitive process going? How do you create it?
Yeah, so we definitely have a process that we would follow, so our M&A process, but I must say it's never quite linear, Mike, as you can imagine. But that said, any mergers and acquisitions engagement will always start with us trying to get to know who the client is. So why do they want to exit? What would constitute a good exit for them? So is it valuation that is the most important? Is the structure of the deal really critical? So are they looking for a share buyout versus an asset buyout? Do they want to exit completely? A lot of business owners will want to leave some chips on the table. Or they might be willing to roll over some equity if it's a private, equity firm that's looking at buying them. It's important to understand if they're willing to take an earnout or not. As well, I'd say that we want to really understand what is the end result that they'd like to see for the company and its employees. And I must say, legacy is often very important for business owners wanting to exit. Realistically, Mike, I think a lot of these points are all questions that owners could be fleshing out themselves or even with their advisors, even before entering into any M&A process. I recently spoke to an owner actually last week who wants to exit his company, and it was his wealth advisor who did a preliminary valuation of the business for planning purposes, which I found very useful.
So, as you know, we do evaluations for our clients as well through your organization. How do you leverage that information? Like, what does that really tell you for a starting point?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that fair market value can really only be determined in the open market, but it helps immensely if owners are proactive in understanding their company's worth, as it helps them set reasonable deal expectations surrounding value when we do go to market. And in our planning stage, we too are trying to understand the financial health and valuation of the business. Plus, we're clarifying the operational and the growth opportunities of the company, thus articulating why someone would want to buy the business, all while identifying who could form part of really the ideal buyer pool. And once we know the business and the industry, we would then prepare our marketing materials, starting with a teaser, which is basically a one-page highlights of the company that we'd send to the buyer pool. And then our pitch deck, or our confidential information memorandum, or sometimes we call it a SIM, which is really a more in-depth overview of the business and the buy-side opportunity. And we would send that to our qualified buyers. At this point, we would have internally assessed the value of the company and created our data rooms for the due diligence process. And our objectives at this stage is really to manage the timing of when we go to market with the hope of bringing multiple offers to the table simultaneously. And that's the competitive process.
Sure, I'm sure it's not easy. How do you get there? How do you do it?
Yeah, it's definitely not easy. Buyer interest can shift over time, and we may need to change our strategy. It's truly a mastery, I'd say, of managing a lot of moving pieces. But once we do have multiple offers, we're typically ready to select an offer that makes the most sense for the buyer, which is why that pre-planning stage is so incredibly important. And then we would assist the company further with the due diligence process, ensuring the purchase agreement is in line with the agreed to terms of the deal, and then ultimately managing the close.
So, I mean, this sounds like a lot, but typically how long does it take to close a deal?
Generally, we would tell our clients that on average, it's around 6 to 9 months, but I'm sure I mentioned that there's a lot of bumps in the road, right? It's not that linear process. And no two deals are really alike. But if I had to wage a guess, it would be 6 to 9 months.
And if I'm an owner and I'm approached to sell, what should I be doing? What should I be thinking?
Yeah, I must say, like, I get asked this a lot, Mike, and really when I look at the market this year, like, we've been now providing mergers and acquisition services for 6 years, and we've never seen a crazier market as 2020 and 2021 thus far. There have been so many search funds pop up this past year. Companies themselves have access to excess cash and want to grow via acquisition, specifically as they look at the market opportunity and the potential a number of distressed companies that will potentially go up for sale. As well, even pre-COVID, private equity firms were sitting on a lot of dry powder and excess capital, and they're still looking at making new investments. So I would say if you're a business owner that has been approached to sell, that is obviously fantastic. And I just say know your options and do your homework with your advisors to understand if it's a good deal. So obviously being approached doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the best deal out there.
Right.
If we're engaged in this scenario, we'd want to determine first that the offer is fair and at market, and figure out if we then need to create that competitive process. Otherwise, I'm going to say that our process really wouldn't change. And we say that because finding the buyer for a business isn't actually the hard part of managing a sell side mandate for us. It's everything in between, and it's really getting the deal to that finish line that is the key.
So when do you advise your clients to share the news with their employees? When does it make sense to let them to know that, hey, this is on the table?
Yeah, I think you have to share it with a few key employees, but timing is really important. Realistically, I would say that most owners would be relying on their CFOs or even their internal and external accountants to help gather a lot of the financial information. So I would suggest bringing them in sooner rather than later. As well, depending on the size of the company, the senior leadership team should be brought in, specifically, I would say, when a letter of intent is signed. Again, I think each situation is different, Mike, so our recommendation wouldn't necessarily be boilerplated. And I'd say that for each owner selling their business, they would need to consider who is the champion for that business sale, both before and after, so pre and post exit.
So you mentioned getting a letter of intent as a key milestone, sort of an inflection point. What else should owners be considering at this stage?
Yeah, I think realistically, a lot of the planning and fleshing out the deal structure is done either before or at the LOA stage, as we're trying to address, what is the valuation of the company, possible earnouts or financing arrangements. We're looking at working capital scenarios and the overall timing of the deal. We're doing a lot of this up front so we can try to address anything thrown our way, and we're obviously trying to do that very quickly to keep the deal going.
Yeah.
Pre-LOI, and even before working with us, my advice is really twofold. And the first really goes back to what my colleague Stefan was talking about in the first series or episode, and that is get your house in order, as due diligence can really be a beast for many companies looking to exit, and you don't want to scare off a buyer at this stage. So obviously, we're hoping to do all of that preliminary due diligence well in advance, so that won't happen. But a lot of that is really dependent on whether the owners themselves have done their homework in getting that house in order. Secondly, I would say it's ensuring you've done any kind of tax planning well in advance of a deal. So for example, if you want to use your lifetime capital gains exemption, then you have to have your company structured properly to take advantage of that. Or at a minimum, understand what you're leaving on the table if a buyer is purchasing your assets and the shares. Post LOI, so this is much further down the line, but I would say that owners and their teams simply need to support the due diligence process, because typically that is a lot of work. And of course, I'd say it's figuring out what they want to spend and how they want to protect their newfound wealth, which I know your team can help with.
Yeah, so that's a great segue. Thank you very much, Candace. This has been very helpful, and I hope it's been helpful for everyone that's been listening in for this 4-part series, which will culminate in a webinar about, okay, you've done it, you've sold, you've got some money in your pocket, you've got a life in front of you. How do you manage through that? So thanks once again. This has been awesome, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Mike.